Kale awoke to darkness and the smell of damp stone. His head throbbed with each beat of his heart, and the metallic taste of blood lingered on his tongue. Slowly, his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through a small, barred window high above. A prison cell, rough-hewn from the ruddy stone of what he now remembered was the desert planet Xylos. The last thing he remembered was the attack. He'd been a simple engineer on the Earth cargo ship Hermes when the raiders struck. Fast, brutal, efficient. Most of the crew had been killed. The lucky ones, perhaps. A harsh, guttural sound echoed down the corridor outside his cell. Kale tensed, recognizing it as the language of the Cthar, the reptilian warriors who had captured him. He'd seen enough of them during the raid to know their reputation for cruelty wasn't exaggerated. Tall, powerful beings with scales like burnished copper and eyes that betrayed no mercy. Heavy footsteps approached. A Cthar guard appeared before his cell, towering at nearly 7 feet, its muscular frame covered in segmented armor. The guard banged a metal rod against the bars, sending a painful ringing through Kale's already aching head. "Up! Earth meat!" the guard growled in broken universal standard. Time for sorting. Kale was roughly pulled from his cell and shoved into a line with other prisoners. A motley collection of species he could only partially identify. Some were humanoid, others distinctly alien. All shared the same look of fear and resignation. As they shuffled forward, Kale studied his fellow captives. Most kept their eyes down, but one figure caught his attention, a slender, graceful woman with skin the pale blue of a frozen lake. Her head was crowned with crest-like ridges rather than hair, decorated with simple metallic beads that clinked softly when she moved. Despite her delicate appearance, her eyes burned with quiet defiance. She carried a long, ornate spear that seemed oddly out of place in a prison. The woman noticed his gaze and held it for a moment. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of shared circumstance, if not shared species. "Eyes down, off-worlder," she whispered in perfect standard. The Cthar punished the defiant first. Kale quickly averted his gaze, but whispered back, "I'm Kale, engineer from Earth." "Lyra," she replied simply. "And you're far from home, Engineer Kale." Before they could exchange more words, the line stopped at a large sorting chamber. A Cthar official, adorned with elaborate armor and facial markings denoting high rank, examined each prisoner. Most were directed to mining or labor camps, but when the official reached Kale and Lyra, he bared his teeth in what might have been a smile. "Combat capable," he announced for Kale, despite the engineer's lean frame and obvious lack of fighting experience. When he reached Lyra, his grin widened. "Zillion Rebel, Equatorial Arena." Lyra stiffened but remained silent. Kale noticed her grip tighten on her spear, which the Cthar had strangely allowed her to keep. Only then did he see that the weapon was damaged. A hairline fracture ran down its shaft, and the crystal at its tip was dulled. They were herded together with a dozen other combat-capable prisoners toward what Kale would soon learn was the infamous Equatorial Arena, the bloody entertainment center for Cthar nobility. That night, locked in a communal cell with the other arena-bound captives, Kale managed to position himself near Lyra. "Why do they let you keep your weapon?" he asked quietly. Lyra traced her finger along the spear's shaft. "They believe it brings greater glory to defeat a Zillion who wields a traditional weapon." Her voice was bitter. "This spear has been in my family line for generations. It's meant to channel our spiritual energy, but the crystal was damaged when I was captured. Now it's little more than a pointed stick." "Why were you captured?" Kale asked. Lyra's eyes hardened. "I fought back. The Cthar have occupied Xylos for nearly a decade. They've banned our ancient laws, desecrated our sacred sites, turned my people into slaves or entertainment." She nodded toward the spear. "Carrying this openly is itself an act of rebellion." An elderly Zillion man across the cell watched them with interest, his own crest ridges gray and worn. Kale noticed, but thought little of it at the time. The next morning, they were awakened by the clanging of metal and the jeers of Cthar guards. "Today you bleed for glory," the lead guard announced with grotesque enthusiasm. "The nobles have gathered for the blood games. Consider yourselves fortunate. A quick death in the arena is better than slow death in the mines. The prisoners were marched through a series of tunnels that sloped gradually upward until they emerged into blinding sunlight. Cale squinted against the glare, and as his vision adjusted, he found himself standing at the edge of a massive, circular arena. The ground was packed red. Sand, stained darker in places where previous contestants had met their end. Surrounding the arena were tiered seats carved from stone, filled with Cthar spectators in various finery. The prisoners were given minimal equipment, leather padding that would do little against serious weapons. Cale received a dull machete that felt awkward in his hands. Lyra refused any additional weapons, clutching only her damaged spear. A horn blasted, and a voice boomed across the arena. "Welcome, noble ones, to the Equatorial Blood Games. Today's entertainment, a squad battle. Survivors earn the right to fight another day." Gates opened around the perimeter, and several heavily armed Cthar fighters entered the arena, their armor lighter than military grade, but far superior to the prisoners' protection. They formed a loose circle around the captives. "Begin," the announcer shouted. Chaos erupted immediately. 2 prisoners fell in the first minute, their inexperience fatal against trained fighters. Cale dodged and retreated, using his agility to avoid direct confrontation. Lyra, despite her slender frame, moved with practiced precision, using her spear to keep attackers at a distance. For a brief moment, they were succeeding in merely surviving, until 3 Cthar fighters coordinated their attack on Lyra. She spun and struck out with her spear, catching one across the shoulder, but the other 2 closed in. A heavy blow from a Cthar club struck her spear near its existing fracture. The weapon snapped in two with a sound like breaking glass, the bottom half remaining in her grip while the pointed end fell to the sand. Lyra's expression changed from defiance to something close to despair. In Zillion culture, Cale would later learn, a broken weapon in battle was more than a tactical disadvantage. It was a spiritual wound. The Cthar fighters closed in for the kill. Lyra backed away, holding the broken shaft before her in a futile defensive posture. The crowd roared in anticipation of blood. Cale acted without thinking. Perhaps it was basic human decency, or perhaps something more, but he couldn't watch her die. He sprinted across the sand and dove for the pointed half of her spear. His fingers closed around it just as the lead Cthar warrior raised his blade to strike Lyra. With a yell born of fear and determination, Cale thrust the broken spear upward, catching the Cthar under his armor. The creature howled in pain and staggered back. Using the moment of surprise, Cale positioned himself beside Lyra, holding the pointed spear in like a dagger. "Back to back," he shouted to her. Lyra's eyes widened, but she quickly moved into position, her back against his, the broken shaft in her hands now a crude, bludgeoning weapon. Together, they fought off the remaining attackers. Cale had no combat training, but desperation made him unpredictable. Lyra moved with trained precision, and somehow they complemented each other. When the horn blew to end the match, they stood bloody but alive among the few surviving prisoners. As guards approached to return them to the cells, Cale noticed the elderly Zillion prisoner staring at them with an expression of shock. The old man's eyes darted between Cale, Lyra, and the broken spear, and he began muttering in his native tongue. "What's he saying?" Cale asked Lyra as they were marched back to the tunnels. "Nothing," Lyra said sharply, but her eyes betrayed concern. "Just an old man's ramblings." Back in their cell, Cale collapsed against the wall, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. His hands were blistered from gripping the spear fragment, and a shallow cut across his ribs stung with sweat. "You shouldn't have done that," Lyra said quietly, sitting beside him. "Let you die? I'm not that far gone yet," Cale replied. "No," picked up my broken spear. Her voice had an odd quality, not angry but troubled. "It complicates things." Before she could explain, a Cthar guard approached their cell. "You too. Entertaining fight. You've been upgraded." The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable. Higher security for valuable assets. They were separated from the other prisoners and taken to a smaller cell deep within the prison complex. It offered slightly better conditions, clean water, actual cots instead of floor mats, but the bars were thicker and the guards more numerous. Your heroics earned us better accommodations. At least, Kale commented, trying to lighten the mood. Lyra didn't smile. They're keeping us alive for bigger spectacles. The Cathar betting pools will pay premium for matches featuring the Off-Worlder and the Zillion Rebel. Kale sat on one of the cots. Then we need to escape before the next match. Escape? Lyra laughed humorlessly. From the highest security section of an arena complex on a planet you don't know, controlled by warriors who know every grain of sand in the desert. I've gotten out of tight spots before, Kale said, though none as tight as this. I'm an engineer. I notice things, weaknesses in systems, patterns in guard rotations. Lyra studied him with newfound interest. And I know this planet and the Cathar patterns of behavior. She hesitated, then added, perhaps there's value in cooperation, off-worlder. Over the next days, they observed and planned. Kale noted that the water pipes feeding their cell came from somewhere above, suggesting a route to the surface. Lyra confirmed that the arena complex was built into the edge of a mesa, with the lower levels, where they were kept, burrowing into the rock face. They learned the guard shifts changed during the feeding time, creating a brief window when attention was divided. Kale also discovered a weakness in the cell door mechanism, a slightly bent rod that could potentially be exploited with the right tool. On the 5th day of their captivity, nature provided the opportunity they needed. The first tremors came during the midday meal, slight vibrations that rattled the cups on their trays. Dust storm, Lyra said, her crest ridges quivering slightly as if sensing changes in the air pressure. A big one, moving fast. Within hours, the tremors grew stronger as massive winds battered the mesa. Sand particles found their way through tiny cracks in the ancient structure, accumulating in small piles on the floor. The guards grew agitated, several being called away to secure loose equipment on the upper levels. Now, Lyra whispered as the usual guard at their door was reduced to a single distracted Cathar. Kale had spent days slowly working a metal splinter loose from his cot frame. Now, he used it to trigger the flaw in the door mechanism. After tense moments of careful manipulation, they heard a soft click. The door didn't open immediately. That would be too obvious, but now it could be pushed open when the moment was right. That moment came when the lights flickered, plunging the corridor into momentary darkness. When emergency lighting sputtered on, Kale and Lyra were already moving. The guard fell silently, struck precisely at the base of his skull by Lyra's practiced hand. They moved quickly through the corridors, encountering minimal resistance as most Cathar were occupied with storm preparations. Those they did meet were dispatched quickly, Lyra's combat skills proving far superior to what she'd shown in the arena, where she'd been weakened by days of poor treatment. You've been holding back, Kale whispered as they hid in a storage alcove, waiting for a patrol to pass. Always keep something in reserve, she replied. My father taught me that before the Cathar executed him, they had reached a maintenance shaft that, according to Kale's mental mapping, should lead toward the surface when they heard a familiar voice call out softly from a nearby cell. Liberator, Spear Protector. It was the elderly Zillion from the arena. Lyra hesitated, then moved to the cell. Minter Vazin, I cannot free everyone. The alarm would sound immediately. Not asking that, child, the old man said, pressing close to the bars. But listen, what happened in the arena when the off-worlder raised your broken spear? There's no time for ancient superstitions, Lyra interrupted. The old law still binds. Vazin insisted, gripping the bars with gnarled blue fingers. The protector of the broken spear is bound by fate, too. A distant alarm cut him off. They've discovered our escape, Kale urged. We need to move. Lyra nodded reluctantly. May the winds guide you, Minter, she said to the old man. And you, child, Vazin replied, then fixed his gaze on Kale. Protect her broken spear? Your fates are now entwined. As they hurried away, Kale asked, what was he talking about? Later, Lyra said tersely, if we survive. They reached the maintenance shaft, a narrow tube barely wide enough for Kale's shoulders that angled upward through the mesa rock. Rusted metal rungs provided a precarious ladder. This should reach a ventilation exit near the top of the mesa, Kale said. From there, we can... The rest of his words were drowned out as the entire structure shuddered violently. The storm had intensified beyond normal parameters. Megastorm, Lyra breathed, eyes wide. They come once a decade. We need to hurry. These old structures can collapse. They climbed as quickly as possible, the shaft growing hotter as they ascended. The air filled with red dust, making breathing difficult. Another violent tremor shook the shaft, dislodging stones and nearly breaking the rusted rung under Kale's foot. After what seemed like hours of climbing, they reached a grate that opened onto the mesa top. The scene beyond was apocalyptic. Red-orange darkness swirling with flying debris, the wind howling like a living creature. The grate itself was partially blocked by fallen rubble. "We'll be shredded if we go out there," Kale shouted over the wind. "We'll be executed if we stay," Lyra countered, already pushing against the debris blocking. Their exit. Together they forced the opening wide enough to squeeze through, emerging onto the storm-ravaged mesa top. The wind immediately threatened to tear them from their feet. They crawled rather than walked, using scattered equipment and rock formations for shelter. The arena complex behind them was barely visible through the swirling sand, but flashing lights indicated security forces were mobilizing despite the storm. "There!" Lyra pointed to a small utility vehicle used for arena maintenance. "If it still works." A figure loomed suddenly from the storm. A Cathar guard carrying a shock lance. "Prisoners!" he roared, the word nearly lost in the howling wind. The guard lunged at Lyra, but the storm threw off his balance. His lance still caught her across the shoulder, sending her sprawling. Kale grabbed a piece of metal debris and swung it desperately, connecting with the guard's head with a sickening crack. The Cathar dropped. Kale helped Lyra to her feet. Blood seeped from her shoulder, but she gritted her teeth and pushed toward the vehicle. Miraculously, it started, its engine designed to withstand Xylo's harsh conditions. "Head west," Lyra shouted as Kale took the controls. Away from the city, Kale could barely see 5 feet ahead, but he gunned the engine and pointed the vehicle in what he hoped was west, away from the arena complex and into the open desert. The storm both concealed their escape and threatened their survival, a deadly irony not lost on him as they plunged into the red maelstrom. For hours they drove blindly, the vehicle's navigation system useless in the electromagnetic interference generated by the megastorm. Kale relied on Lyra's occasional course corrections, trusting her innate sense of direction on her native planet. Gradually, the storm's fury lessened, the howling reduced to a moan, then a whisper. When they finally stopped, night had fallen, and they found themselves in a vast sea of dunes, the sand still settling around them. "We should be far enough away now," Lyra said, examining the vehicle's fuel gauge. "But we have maybe half a tank left, not enough to reach any settlements loyal to the resistance." Kale stepped out, his legs wobbly after the tense drive. The air was still thick with dust, but the stars were becoming visible overhead, constellations entirely foreign to him, a stark reminder of how far he was from Earth. "What now?" he asked, surveying the endless desert. "We survive," Lyra said simply. "And to do that, we need water." Their vehicle had emergency supplies, a small water purifier, basic medical equipment, emergency rations designed for Cathar physiology, but safe enough for Lyra and passable for Kale. They treated Lyra's shoulder wound and took inventory of their meager resources. As they worked, Kale finally asked the question that had been bothering him since their escape. "What was that old man Vazin talking about?" "The old law and broken spears." Lyra sighed, touching the fragment of her spear that she'd managed to keep during their escape. "It's an ancient Zillion tradition from before we achieved space flight. Practically forgotten now, especially since the Cathar outlawed our traditional practices." She traced the fracture line on the spear shaft. "This spear is an heirloom, passed through my maternal line for generations. It's not just a weapon, but a symbol of authority and spiritual connection. In ancient times, if a warrior's symbolic weapon broke in battle and anyone, picked up the broken piece to defend them, it created a sacred bond. What kind of bond? Kale asked. The kind that can't be broken, Lyra said, her eyes reflecting the starlight. The defender becomes the chosen one, bound by duty and fate to protect the warrior and help them complete their mission. It was a way of recognizing those who act selflessly in moments of crisis. Kale stared at her. You're saying because I picked up your broken spear in the arena, I'm now magically obligated to help you? Not magically, Lyra corrected. Spiritually and culturally. It's a bond of honor, not enchantment. She paused. Of course, it's just an old superstition now. I don't expect you to believe in it. Good, because I don't, Kale said firmly. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, not because of some ancient law. And I'm helping you now for the same reason, and because we both want to survive. Lyra nodded, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced the old law was mere superstition. At dawn, they began the difficult task of desert survival. The megastorm had transformed the landscape, obliterating familiar landmarks and creating new dune formations. Lyra had to rely on the position of Xylo's twin suns to maintain their direction. Their first priority was water. Lyra showed Kale how to identify certain rock formations that often concealed underground moisture pockets. Kale's engineering knowledge helped them modify the vehicle's coolant system to extract additional water from the air, stretching their supplies. The desert revealed itself as paradoxically both empty and full of life. Crystal lizards, nearly invisible until they moved, sunned themselves on rocks. Giant sand scorpions lurked beneath the surface, detecting vibrations of potential prey. Lyra taught Kale which creatures were dangerous, which were edible, and which might lead them to water. On the third day, they encountered one of the desert's deadliest predators, a dune stalker, a creature like a cross between a spider and a crocodile, with chameleonic skin that changed color to match the sand. It attacked without warning, erupting from beneath their campsite as they prepared to continue their journey. Kale was knocked aside immediately, the creature focusing its primary attack on Lyra. She rolled away from snapping jaws, reaching for her broken spear. The dune stalker's tail whipped around, catching her leg and dragging her toward its maw. Without hesitation, Kale grabbed the vehicle's antenna, snapped it off, and drove it into the creature's eye. The dune stalker shrieked, releasing Lyra to attack Kale. He barely dodged its lunge, falling backward into the sand. Lyra seized the moment, thrusting her broken spear into the creature's unarmored underbelly. The dune stalker convulsed violently, then collapsed. They stood there, breathing heavily, covered in sand and the creature's ichor. Lyra limped to Kale's side and offered her hand to help him up. "Thank you," she said simply. Kale took her hand. "I guess I'm taking this chosen one thing seriously after all," he joked weakly. A ghost of a smile touched Lyra's lips. Maybe the old law has some wisdom in it. That night, as they camped in the shelter of a rock formation, Lyra opened up about her people's struggle. Before the Cathar invasion, the Xilians were a peaceful civilization balancing advanced technology with spiritual traditions. The Cathar arrived a decade ago, ostensibly for trade, but quickly revealed their true intentions, using their military superiority to subjugate the Xilian population. "My parents were scholars," Lyra explained, poking at their small fire. "They documented our history, preserved our ancient texts. The Cathar burned the archives first, knowing that a people without history are easier to control." "Your parents didn't escape?" Kale asked gently. Lyra shook her head. "My father died defending the archives. My mother gave me this spear and told me to run. I later heard she was executed for sedition, teaching Xilian history to children in secret. So you joined the resistance," Kale concluded. "I became the resistance in my region," Lyra corrected, "until I was captured attempting to sabotage a Cathar mining operation that was destroying a sacred site." Kale was quiet for a moment, contemplating the vast difference between their worlds. His problems on Earth, career frustrations, a failed relationship, crushing student debt, seemed trivial compared to Lyra's struggle for her people's very existence. Earth has had its share of conquerors and resistances too, he finally said. My grandparents were refugees from a war zone. They used to tell me that survival itself is a form of resistance sometimes. Lyra looked at him with new appreciation. Your world sounds more like mine than I thought. Over the next few days, as they made their way across the desert, their relationship shifted from reluctant allies to something approaching friendship. Kale's ingenuity repeatedly proved useful. He fashioned a solar still to collect more water, repaired their vehicle when it broke down, and created a signaling device from spare parts. Lyra, in turn, kept them alive with her knowledge of Xylo's environment. She taught Kale to move efficiently in the deep sand, to recognize poisonous desert plants, to read the subtle signs of weather changes that could mean life or death in the wasteland. On the 7th day after their escape, they spotted an unusual rock formation in the distance. That's not natural, Kale observed as they approached. It's not, Lyra agreed, her voice hushed with reverence. It's an ancient Xylian sanctuary, a sacred oasis. I didn't realize we were this close to the Whispering Canyons. The rock formation revealed itself to be an elaborate structure carved directly from the sandstone cliff face. Weather-worn columns flanked an entrance partially obscured by drifting sand. Ancient symbols covered the facade, spiraling patterns and angular script that Kale couldn't decipher. Can we find water here? He asked practically. Yes, and more, Lyra said, her crest ridges quivering with emotion. These sanctuaries were built over natural springs, and they often contain historical records, knowledge the Cthar haven't destroyed. Inside, the air was noticeably cooler. Carved channels in the floor guided them to a central chamber where water bubbled up from an underground spring, filling a small pool. The walls were covered with elaborate murals depicting Xylian history, scenes of daily life, ceremonial gatherings, and what appeared to be significant historical events. While Kale replenished their water supplies, Lyra moved slowly around the chamber, her fingers tracing the ancient images. She stopped suddenly before a particular section, her breath catching. Kale, she called softly. Look at this. He joined her, squinting at the faded mural. It showed a Xylian warrior with a broken spear, falling before an enemy. Beside the warrior stood another figure, clearly not Xylian, lacking the characteristic crest ridges, holding the broken piece of the spear in a defensive posture. The old law, Kale murmured, recognizing the scene from Lyra's description. This is the origin story, Lyra confirmed. The first chosen one was not Xylian at all, but a traveler from another world who saved a Xylian chieftain in battle. Their combined strength drove back invaders who threatened to destroy our people. She pointed to subsequent panels showing the non-Xylian figure standing with the chieftain in various scenes, rebuilding villages, establishing defenses, creating new treaties with neighboring tribes. The old law doesn't just bind the chosen one to protect, Lyra explained, her voice taking on the cadence of recitation. It binds both parties together in common purpose. The protected becomes the protector's purpose. The protector becomes the protected's strength. Kale studied the ancient images, feeling a strange resonance. Is that why the old man in the prison, Vazin, was so excited when I picked up your spear? He thought history was repeating itself. Perhaps, Lyra acknowledged. There's more to it, though. She guided him to another section of the mural, partially obscured by mineral deposits. The Xylian texts speak of a prophecy that in our darkest hour, when our people face extinction, another off-worlder will raise a broken spear and help bring liberation. Kale stepped back, uncomfortable. I'm just an engineer who did something decent in a horrible situation. I'm not part of some ancient prophecy. Maybe prophecies are just stories we tell until someone decides to make them true, Lyra suggested. Before Kale could respond, they heard the distinctive whine of Cthar hover vehicles outside the sanctuary. They've tracked us, Lyra hissed, pulling Kale away from the entrance. There must be a rear exit. These sanctuaries usually have escape routes. They found a narrow passage leading deeper into the cliff face, eventually emerging into a steep canyon behind the structure. Below them stretched a labyrinth of interconnected ravines and gorges, the whispering canyons that Lyra had mentioned. "If we can reach the canyon network, we might lose them," Lyra said, already starting down the treacherous path. They had barely reached the canyon floor when energy blasts struck the cliff beside them. Looking up, they saw Cthar scouts on the ridge, taking aim for another volley. "Run!" Kale grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her into the maze of canyons as energy weapons scorched the ground behind them. The pursuit that followed was a desperate game of hide-and-seek through the twisting ravines. The Cthar had superior weapons and tracking technology, but Lyra's knowledge of the terrain and Kale's quick thinking kept them one step ahead. As night fell, they found temporary shelter in a narrow cave, barely more than a crevice in the canyon wall. Pressed close together in the confined space, they listened to the sounds of Cthar search parties echoing through the canyons. "They're being thorough," Kale whispered. "Why are they dedicating so many resources to recapturing 2 escaped prisoners?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment. "It's not just about us escaping. It's about what we represent." She touched the broken spear shaft she still carried. "The arena escape during a megastorm has already become a story spreading among my people. Cthar communication channels have been abuzz with reports of increased resistance activities since our escape. We become symbols," Kale realized. "Symbols are powerful on Xylos," Lyra confirmed, "and dangerous to those who rule through fear." They spent a restless night in the cave, taking turns keeping watch. By morning, the sounds of pursuit had faded, but they knew the Cthar wouldn't give up easily. Picking their way carefully through the canyon system, they came upon a surprising sight: recent signs of habitation. Fire pits, carefully concealed, water collection systems ingeniously designed to blend with the natural rock formations, small gardens of desert plants cultivated in protected alcoves. "Resistance?" Kale asked quietly. Lyra nodded, hope lighting her features. "One of the hidden enclaves. We need to find them." They followed the subtle signs deeper into the canyon network. Occasionally, they spotted markers that Lyra identified as resistance trail signs, small arrangements of stones or notches in the canyon walls that would appear natural to untrained eyes. Late in the afternoon, they rounded a bend to find themselves facing the drawn weapons of a half-dozen Xiliens in desert camouflage. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then an elderly female Xilien stepped forward, her elaborate crest ridges marked with silver beads denoting wisdom and spiritual authority. "Lower your weapons," she commanded the others. "These are the ones from the vision." The resistance fighters hesitantly obeyed. The elderly Xilien, a priestess, Kale would learn, approached them slowly, her eyes fixed on the broken spear in Lyra's hand. "So," she said in a voice weathered by age and hardship, "the off-worlder who raised the broken spear has come to the canyons, just as the waters foretold." Kale opened his mouth to protest this mystical interpretation, but Lyra squeezed his arm in warning. "Honored priestess," Lyra said with a formal bow, "I am Lyra, daughter of scholars Talon and Mira. This is Kale of Earth, who indeed raised my broken spear in the equatorial arena to protect me." "I know who you are, child," the priestess replied. "The winds have whispered your story across the desert." She turned her penetrating gaze to Kale. "And you, chosen one, do you accept the bond of the old law?" Kale glanced at Lyra, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. "I helped Lyra because it was right," he said carefully. "I'll continue to help her because it's still right. If that satisfies your old law, then yes." The priestess smiled faintly. "Truth spoken plainly is refreshing in these deceptive times. Come, you must be exhausted and hungry. The Cthar patrols will not find this place." They were led through a series of increasingly narrow passages that eventually opened into a hidden valley nestled deep within the canyon system. Here, several hundred Xiliens had created a secret community. Dwellings were built into the canyon walls, gardens flourished in protected areas, and children, the first Kale had seen on Xylos, played under the watchful eyes of their elders. "The canyon enclave," Lyra breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "I'd heard stories, but never knew its location." "Few do," the priestess said. "That is how we have survived these 10 years of occupation." They were given food, clean water, and a small cave dwelling to rest in. After so many days in the open desert, the relative comfort and safety was overwhelming. Kale found himself fighting back unexpected tears as he washed away layers of grime and tended properly to the various injuries he'd accumulated during their escape and journey. Later, they were summoned to the priestess's chambers, a larger cave illuminated by bioluminescent fungi cultivated in patterns across the ceiling. Several resistance leaders had gathered, regarding Kale with open curiosity and Lyra with respect. "Now," the priestess said, settling onto a cushioned stone seat, "we must speak of greater matters than your escape. The broken spear you carry is more than a family heirloom, Lyra." Lyra's expression showed surprise. "What do you mean, Honor Priestess? Your mother never told you its full history? Perhaps she didn't know." The priestess sighed. "That spear contains a crystal from the sacred caves of Jala. Before the Cthar came, it was one of 7 ceremonial weapons that, when united, could access the energy matrices buried beneath our ancient temples." One of the resistance leaders, a battle-scarred Zillion with a prosthetic arm, spoke up. "Tales for children, priestess. We need practical solutions, not myths." "Is it myth that the Cthar weapons falter near the temple ruins?" the priestess countered. "Is it myth that their sensors cannot penetrate certain areas of our world? The ancient technologies of our ancestors were not based on conventional physics, Commander Toros. They worked with energies the Cthar do not understand, energies tied to the spiritual connection between Zillions and this planet." Kale listened with growing fascination. As an engineer, he'd encountered many technologies throughout the galaxy that initially seemed like magic until their principles were understood. The idea that ancient Zillions had developed something the technologically advanced Cthar couldn't comprehend was intriguing. "Even if this is true," Lyra said, examining her broken spear, "the spear is damaged. Its crystal is dulled. Because it is dormant," the priestess explained. "The crystals respond to certain energies, specifically the combined will of a true Zillion warrior and their chosen one. This is the deeper purpose of the old law, lost to most in our modern age. The bond between protector and protected creates a unique energy signature that can activate the ancient technologies." Kale raised an eyebrow. "You're saying our connection could power a weapon against the Cthar?" "Not exactly a weapon," the priestess corrected. "A disruption field. The ancient texts speak of how our ancestors used the crystals to create zones where certain technologies, particularly those based on aggression, simply ceased functioning. A nonviolent defense system," Lyra murmured thoughtfully. "It would match our ancestors' philosophy." Commander Toros snorted. "And how convenient that we need this off-worlder and your broken stick to make it work. Priestess, we have planned a conventional assault on the Cthar Command Center. We don't have time for her." "Your conventional assault will fail," the priestess interrupted sharply. "I've seen it in the waters. Without the advantage the ancient technologies can provide, the Cthar will slaughter your fighters." A tense silence fell over the chamber. Kale glanced at Lyra, who was staring intently at her broken spear. "What would we need to do?" Lyra finally asked. The priestess's expression softened. "First, you must truly accept the bond of the old law, not as a superstition or obligation, but as a willing partnership. Then, you must take the spear to the Temple of Echoes in the Crimson Valley. There, if the prophecies are true, your combined will can reawaken the crystal." "The Crimson Valley is deep in Cthar territory," Commander Toros objected. "Heavily patrolled since they discovered the ruins there interfere with their technologies. Which is precisely why they must go," the priestess countered. "The Cthar fear what they don't understand. They guard the temple because they sense its importance, even if they cannot comprehend it." Kale felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. He had never asked for this. His only goal had been to survive and find a way back to Earth. Now he was being drawn into a planetary rebellion, a spiritual prophecy, and an ancient technological mystery. He looked at Lyra, finding her eyes already on him. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. "I think," she said slowly, "that I never believed in the old law until I met you. But I've seen how we work together, how we've survived against impossible odds." She touched the broken spear. "If there's even a chance this could help my people." Kale nodded, making his decision. "I'm an engineer. If there's ancient technology to reactivate, I should at least take a look." To the priestess, he said, "We'll go to this temple, but we'll need guides, supplies, and as much information as you can give us about what to expect." The priestess smiled, satisfaction evident in her ancient eyes. "You speak practically, yet you have already embraced the spirit of the bond. Preparations will begin immediately." Later that night, unable to sleep despite comfortable bedding, Kale stood at the entrance of their dwelling, gazing up at the unfamiliar stars. The canyon walls framed a narrow strip of night sky where Xylo's smaller moon cast a pale blue light over the landscape. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Lyra approaching. She had changed into traditional Xylian garments provided by the Enclave, flowing fabrics in desert hues that complemented her blue skin. "Second thoughts?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "About 100 of them," Kale admitted with a small smile. "I keep thinking about how I ended up here. A month ago, I was fixing coolant systems on a cargo hauler, complaining about overtime. Now, I'm supposedly part of an ancient prophecy on a desert planet. And bound to a rebel you barely know," Lyra added softly. Kale turned to her. "I know more about you than you might think. I know you're brave. You stood alone against the Cthar in that arena. I know you're loyal. You've dedicated your life to your people's freedom. I know you're resourceful. You kept us alive in the desert." He paused. "Those seem like pretty good qualities in someone I'm bound to." Lyra's crest ridges fluttered slightly, a sign of emotion, Kale had learned. "And I know you're compassionate. You risked your life for a stranger. I know you're adaptable. You've survived in an alien environment with remarkable skill. I know you're honest. You question the prophecy openly rather than pretending blind faith." Her eyes met his. Those are rare qualities in times of war. Something shifted between them in that moment, the bond of necessity and circumstance deepening into genuine connection. Kale found himself reaching for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers cool against his warm human skin. "Whatever this old law actually means," Kale said quietly, "I made my choice in that arena when I picked up your spear. Not because of prophecy or destiny, but because it was the right thing to do. I'll keep making that same choice every day we're together." Lyra's free hand touched the broken spear hanging at her side. "Perhaps that's exactly what the old law truly means," she whispered. At dawn, they began intensive preparations for their journey to the Temple of Echoes. The resistance fighters provided them with desert-adapted clothing, water reclamation devices, weapons that wouldn't attract Cthar sensors, and detailed knowledge of the terrain they would cross. The priestess spent hours with Lyra, teaching her meditation techniques, said to strengthen her connection to the crystal in her spear. Meanwhile, Commander Tauros, despite his skepticism, proved to be a valuable tutor for Kale, training him in basic combat techniques suited to his build and reflexes. "You move well for an engineer," Tauros grudgingly admitted after Kale successfully executed a defensive maneuver. "Still, don't try to fight like a Xylian or a Cthar. Use your different physiology to your advantage. You're shorter than Cthar, get inside their reach. You're stronger than you look, use that surprise." By the third day, a plan had formed. They would leave the canyon sanctuary and travel north, skirting the edges of Cthar territory until they reached the Crimson Valley. A small team of resistance fighters would create a distraction on the southern border, drawing Cthar patrols away from their route. On the evening before their departure, the priestess summoned them for a final audience. She looked frilier than before, as if the preparations had drained her energy. "I must tell you something I have withheld," she said without preamble. "The Temple of Echoes is not merely a place of ancient technology. It is a nexus of time and possibility. Those who enter often experience visions of the past, of potential futures, of roads not taken." "Hallucinations?" Kale asked with concern. "More than that," the priestess said. "The The temple exists partially outside conventional reality. It will test you both, your resolve, your bond, your deepest fears. Many have entered seeking its power and never returned, lost in the echoes of what might have been. Lyra gripped her broken spear tightly. Why tell us this now? Because you must be prepared. The stronger your bond before entering, the better your chances of emerging whole. The ancient Zillion reached out, placing one hand on Lyra's head and the other on Kale's. Remember this. In the temple, what seems most real may be illusion, and what seems impossible may be the only truth. Trust each other above all else. With those ominous words ringing in their ears, Kale and Lyra set out at first light, accompanied by 3 resistance scouts who would guide them through the initial leg of their journey before returning to the Enclave. The path took them through increasingly dangerous terrain. Narrow passes where rock slides could be triggered by misplaced step, vast salt flats where there was no shelter from the twin suns, the territory of the fearsome crystal worms that could sense vibrations from kilometers away. Throughout these challenges, Kale noticed a subtle change in his relationship with Lyra. Their coordination became almost intuitive. They moved in sync, anticipated each other's needs, communicated with glances and gestures as much as words. Was this the bond the old law spoke of, or simply the natural result of facing danger together? Kale wasn't sure, but he couldn't deny its effectiveness. On the 5th day, they said farewell to their guides at the edge of a region known as the Sculptor's Waste, a bizarre landscape where wind erosion had carved the sandstone into fantastical shapes resembling twisted towers, massive faces, and impossible arches. The Kthar rarely patrol here, the lead scout explained. Their sensors malfunction, and the stone formations disorient even their best trackers. Follow the path of the 3 sisters. He pointed to 3 tall spires in the distance, and you'll reach the edge of the Crimson Valley in 2 days. After the scouts departed, Kale and Lyra stood alone at the edge of the alien landscape, the wind whistling through the stone labyrinths before them. Ready? Lyra asked, adjusting her pack. Not remotely, Kale replied with a wry smile. But let's go anyway. The Sculptor's Waste was as beautiful as it was treacherous. The ever-changing light created illusions of movement among the stone formations. Passages that seemed straight would curve unexpectedly, leading them in circles if they didn't carefully track the position of the 3 sisters. At night, the temperature dropped dramatically, forcing them to shelter in the lee of the great stone sculptures, huddled together for warmth. It was during their 2nd night in this strange place that disaster struck. A tremor, mild by Xylo's standards but enough to disturb the delicate balance of the eroded formations, caused a cascade of falling stone. Kale shoved Lyra clear of danger, but couldn't fully escape himself. A heavy slab struck his leg, pinning him as more debris threatened to fall. "Kale!" Lyra cried, rushing back despite the danger. "Stay back," he warned as the stone above them groaned ominously. Ignoring him, Lyra wedged her broken spear under the slab, trapping his leg, using it as a lever. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a defiant cry, Lyra put her full weight on the spear. The slab shifted just enough for Kale to pull free, rolling away as more stone crashed down where he had been. They scrambled to safer ground, breathing heavily. Kale tested his leg, painful and badly bruised, but not broken. "That was too close," he gasped. Lyra examined her spear, which had survived its use as an improvised lever. "I thought I'd lose you," she said, her voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. "The Chosen One isn't that easy to get rid of," Kale joked, then grew serious as he saw her expression. "Thank you. You risked your life. As you did for me in the arena," she replied simply. "Perhaps the old law works both ways. Perhaps we are each other's protectors." The incident changed something between them. That night, despite his injured leg, Kale insisted on taking the first watch. As Lyra drifted to sleep beside him, he found himself studying her face, relaxed in repose, the moonlight giving her blue skin an ethereal quality. The realization came to him with surprising clarity. He cared for her beyond the bond of their shared survival. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. By midday of the seventh day, since leaving the Enclave, they reached the edge of the Crimson Valley. The name became immediately obvious. The entire valley floor was covered in red crystal formations that caught the sunlight and scattered it in bloody hues across the landscape. Beautiful, Cale murmured as they surveyed the scene from an elevated ridgeline. And deadly, Lyra added. The crystals are razor-sharp. One false step will slice through even Ktharhide. In the center of the valley stood their destination, a pyramidal structure of black stone, untouched by the red crystal formations that surrounded it. Even from a distance, Cale could sense something odd about the temple. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void in the glittering crimson landscape. Kthar patrols, Lyra whispered, pointing to distant shapes moving along the valley perimeter. Heavy presence. Cale studied the pattern of movement. They're patrolling the edges, but keeping their distance from the temple itself. The priestess was right. They fear it. They waited until nightfall to make their approach. The smaller moon was hidden, leaving only the larger one to cast faint silver light on the crystal field. This dimmer illumination was actually an advantage. Without the direct sunlight, the crystals emitted a subtle bioluminescence, creating a network of safe paths visible only in near darkness. They moved carefully along these glowing trails, freezing whenever Kthar patrols came too close. Twice they had to backtrack when paths ended in crystal thickets. Cale's injured leg ached, but he pushed through the pain, knowing they couldn't afford to rest in such exposed territory. As they drew nearer to the temple, Cale began to experience strange sensations, whispers at the edge of hearing, flickers of movement in his peripheral vision, a sense of being watched by something ancient and aware. From Lyra's increasingly tense posture, he suspected she felt it too. "It knows we're coming," she murmured, so quietly he barely heard her. The base of the temple loomed before them, a smooth black surface with no visible entrance. They circled it cautiously, staying on the safe crystal path, until Lyra stopped abruptly. "There," she said, pointing to what appeared to be a solid section of wall. "I don't see anything," Cale replied, squinting. Lyra raised her broken spear, and to Cale's astonishment, the crystal at its tip, previously dull and lifeless, now emitted a faint blue glow. As she moved it toward the wall, the glow intensified. "The bond is strengthening," she whispered. "The crystal responds." When the spear tip came within inches of the black surface, a seam appeared in the seemingly solid wall. It widened silently, revealing a passage leading into darkness. They exchanged a glance, both remembering the priestess's warning about the temple's nature. Cale reached out and took Lyra's free hand in his. Together, he said firmly, "Whatever happens in there, we face it together." Lyra nodded, her eyes reflecting the blue light of the awakening crystal. Together, she agreed. They stepped across the threshold, and the entrance sealed seamlessly behind them, cutting off the faint moonlight. The only illumination came from Lyra's spear, casting eerie blue shadows on the corridor walls. The passage led downward in a spiral, the black stone beneath their feet so perfectly smooth it seemed almost liquid. The air grew cooler, with a strange electric quality that made the hair on Cale's arm stand on end. "Listen," Lyra whispered, stopping suddenly. "Do you hear them?" Cale held his breath. At first, he heard nothing. Then, gradually, he became aware of sounds, distant conversations, laughter, weeping, shouts of triumph, and despair, all overlapping, as if hundreds of people were speaking at once from very far away. The echoes, he realized. That's why it's called the Temple of Echoes. Not echoes of sound, Lyra corrected, her voice hushed with awe. Echoes of possibility, of lives lived and not lived, of choices made and unmade. The spiral passage finally opened into a vast central chamber. Here, the black stone gave way to a floor of swirling energy, patterns of light that moved like liquid, constantly shifting in color and intensity. The chamber was circular, with a raised dais at its center. As they cautiously entered, The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Cale began to distinguish words and languages he knew and many he didn't. His name, Lyra's name, fragments of conversations they'd had, and others they hadn't. "We need to reach the center," Lyra said, her voice strained. The priestess said we must place the spear on the dais to awaken its full power. They started forward, but with each step, the voices intensified, and the swirling energy beneath their feet began to coalesce into images. Cale saw himself on Earth, accepting a prestigious engineering position he'd been offered before taking the ill-fated cargo ship job. He saw an alternate life unfolding: professional success, comfort, safety. Beside him, Lyra had frozen, staring down at a different vision. Herself as a child, with her parents still alive, their home untouched by Cathar invasion. Her expression was one of longing and pain. "Don't look," Cale urged, forcing himself to turn away from the enticing vision of his alternate life. "Remember what the priestess said. The temple tests us with what might have been." Lyra nodded, visibly struggling to tear her gaze from the vision of her family. They pressed on, but the temple's assault on their senses intensified. The floor between them and the dais became a churning sea of possibilities. Lives where they never met, lives where they met under different circumstances, futures bright and dark, victories and defeats. Halfway to the dais, they encountered a new obstacle. The air before them shimmered, and two figures materialized, Cathar warriors, but with a strange, translucent quality. "Not real," Cale said, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "Just illusions." The illusions, if that's what they were, attacked with frightening speed. Cale felt the impact when one struck him, sending him sprawling across the shifting floor. The pain was certainly real enough. Lyra fared better, her combat training evident as she parried the second Phantom Warrior's attacks with her broken spear. The crystal glowed brighter with each contact, and the Phantom seemed to recoil from it. "The spear affects them," she called to Cale. "Use your half." Cale had kept the pointed end of Lyra's spear since the arena, carrying it as a makeshift dagger. Now he drew it from his belt, noting that it too had begun to glow with the same blue light as Lyra's half. Armed with the broken halves of the same weapon, they fought back against the Phantom Warriors. Each contact with the glowing crystal seemed to disrupt the apparitions, making them flicker and lose cohesion. With a synchronized attack, neither planned nor discussed, but executed as if they'd trained together for years, Cale and Lyra struck the Phantoms simultaneously. The apparitions dissolved into wisps of dark energy that were quickly absorbed by the swirling floor. "The bond," Lyra said breathlessly. "It's getting stronger in here." They continued toward the dais, fighting through more illusions, some attacking directly, others simply trying to distract or mislead them with visions of what they most desired or feared. The voices grew to a deafening chorus, then suddenly ceased as they reached the dais. In the abrupt silence, the central platform revealed its purpose. Two shallow depressions marked its surface, spaced precisely to receive the two halves of the broken spear. "This is it," Lyra said, raising her half. "Are you ready?" Cale nodded, aligning his half of the spear with the appropriate depression. "On three. 1, 2, 3. They placed the broken spear halves into the depressions simultaneously. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then blue light erupted from both crystal fragments, connecting in an arc of energy above the dais. The light expanded outward in a shockwave that passed through them harmlessly, but illuminated the entire chamber in brilliant azure. The floor ceased its chaotic shifting, settling into a steady pattern that reminded Cale of circuitry. Energy flowing along defined pathways to the dais and then outward through the temple walls. And then, the voice, neither male nor female, neither young nor old, seemingly originating from the air around them rather than any specific source. "The bond is recognized," it's stated in perfect standard. "The chosen and the bearer have awakened the sanctuary." Lyra stepped forward. "We seek the power to protect our people from those who would conquer them. The sanctuary does not grant power, the voice replied. It restores balance. Technologies of aggression cannot function within its influence. The choice to use this balance for protection or isolation belongs to those who awaken it. Kale joined Lyra. How far does this influence extend? That depends on the strength of the bond, the voice answered. The shared purpose of chosen and bearer determines the reach of balance. And our broken spear? Lyra asked, indicating the fragments still glowing on the dais, is no longer required here. It has served its purpose in bringing you to the sanctuary. You may take it with you, reforged and recharged with the sanctuary's essence. It will serve as both key and conduit to the energies awakened here. As the voice spoke, the broken halves of the spear rose from the depressions, floating in the air before them. Blue energy surrounded the fragments, and before their eyes, the spear reforged itself, the crystal at its tip now pulsing with vibrant light. Take it, the voice instructed. Bearer and chosen, together. Kale and Lyra reached for the spear simultaneously, their hands meeting on its shaft. The moment they touched it, a surge of energy passed through them both, not painful, but intense, like a current of pure vitality. The sanctuary is awakened, the voice declared. Its influence spreads. Go now. The balance has begun. The blue light flared once more, momentarily blinding them. When their vision cleared, they found themselves standing not in the temple chamber, but outside, on the crystal field of the Crimson Valley. The spear, now whole again, hummed with power in their joined hands. Above them, the night sky was lightening with the approach of dawn, and all around them, Kthar patrol vehicles were dropping from the air, their engines failing as they entered what Kale now understood was a field of technological disruption emanating from the temple. In the distance, they could see Kthar's soldiers emerging from the downed vehicles, their energy weapons inert, their communication devices silent. It's working, Lyra breathed, watching as the confused Kthar try to regroup without their technological advantages. The balance is restored. Kale nodded, feeling the power flowing from the temple through the spear and into the surrounding area. This isn't a weapon of destruction. It's a neutralizer. Within this field, the Kthar have no technological advantage over your people, which means we can fight on equal terms, Lyra said, a fierce joy in her voice. And my people have been fighting for their freedom for a decade. We know how to use spears and bows and our wits. The Kthar rely on their technology. As they watched, the disruption field continued to expand, its boundaries marked by the sequential failure of distant Kthar equipment. It wouldn't cover the entire planet. Kale could sense the limits of its reach, but encompassed the critical command centers of the Kthar occupation in this region. We need to contact the resistance, Lyra said urgently. They need to mobilize now, while the Kthar are vulnerable. Our comm equipment won't work either, Kale pointed out. But we can use this. He gestured to the brilliant temple behind them, now gleaming in the early dawn light. It's visible for kilometers. It's a beacon. Understanding dawned on Lyra's face. The resistance watches for signs. When they see the temple activated, they'll know we succeeded. Throughout that day, they witnessed the beginning of what would later be called the liberation of Xylos. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding places throughout the valley and surrounding territories, armed with traditional weapons and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Kthar, stripped of their technological superiority, found themselves outmatched by determined Zillions fighting for their homeland. By sunset, the first Kthar command outpost had fallen. By the following dawn, 3 more had surrendered. The disruption field held steady, powered by the ancient technologies, and, though neither Kale nor Lyra fully understood how, by the strength of their bond. A week later, they stood on the balcony of what had once been the Kthar governor's palace in the regional capital. Below them, Zillions celebrated in streets reclaimed from their oppressors. The liberation wasn't complete. There were still Kthar strongholds beyond the disruption field's reach, but a critical blow had been struck. Commander Toros, now leading the formal Zillion defense force, joined them on the balcony. His initial skepticism had given way to grudging respect. The priestess was right, he acknowledged. About all of it. She asked me to give you this. He handed Lyra a sealed message container, the kind used for private communications among Zillion elders. Lyra opened it and read the contents, her crest ridges quivering with emotion. She says the waters show more temples can be awakened, that the disruption field can be expanded until the Kthar have no choice but to abandon Xylos entirely. More dangerous journeys, more ancient temples with mind-bending challenges. Kale asked with a wry smile. Sounds exhausting. You could return to Earth, Lyra said quietly, not meeting his eyes. The spaceport is secure now. We could arrange transport. The old law has been fulfilled. You've helped save my people. Kale looked out over the celebrating city, then back at Lyra. The engineer from Earth who had only wanted to fix machines and go home had changed. Or perhaps he had simply discovered who he truly was all along. The old law doesn't end with one victory, he said, taking her hand. The chosen one stands with the bearer until the mission is complete. Your people aren't fully free yet. He paused, then added more softly, besides, Earth will still be there someday. But right now, I'm exactly where I need to be. Lyra's fingers tightened around his. With a broken spear that's no longer broken. With you, Kale corrected. The spear brought us together. But what keeps me here is something the old law recognized but didn't create. As the twin suns of Xylos set behind the distant dunes, casting the desert world in amber and gold, Kale and Lyra stood together, the reforged spear gleaming between them. No longer a symbol of ancient obligation, but of freely chosen purpose. Behind them, the liberation of a world continued. Before them stretched possibilities as vast as the desert itself. And between them, a bond forged in crisis had transformed into something neither prophecy nor ancient law could fully explain, but that both of them, across the gulf of different worlds and different species, recognized simply as love. The Kthar would not yield Xylos easily. The struggle would continue, with victories and setbacks. But something had fundamentally changed, not just in the balance of power, but in the story the Zillions would tell for generations. The tale of an off-worlder who raised a broken spear to protect a stranger, unaware that in that simple act of decency, he had set in motion events that would reshape a world. And perhaps, Kale thought as Lyra's head came to rest against his shoulder, the most powerful ancient technology of all was not the disruption field or the reforged spear, but the mysterious force that drew sentient beings together across the stars, the force that turned strangers into allies, allies into friends, and sometimes, if they were fortunate, friends into something more profound. A force no conqueror, however technologically advanced, could ever truly defeat.